In this segment, I'd like to talk about how to tell when you're really not being asked for an estimate, even when it seems like you are being asked for an estimate, which might also be called do's and don'ts of estimation discussions. This segment is related to my segment on the estimate, target, and commitment process and terminology, and so I'd encourage you to take a look at that segment if you haven't already looked at it. So the first question, when is an estimate not an estimate? Businesses often ask for estimates, or what they call estimates, but what we see is that often they're really asking for a commitment, or they're asking for a plan to meet a target. And we should probably start by defining clearly what an estimate is. A true estimate will normally include some notion of uncertainty. That is, an estimate is an analytical prediction, an approximation, and so there's going to be some notion of a range, or best case, worst case, or a percentage likelihood, or just some notion of variability or uncertainty in anything that truly is an estimate. Now, in contrast, a commitment is normally a single point. It's not an estimate, and it does not contain any notion of uncertainty or probability. So a commitment is normally one specific date. We will be done by January 14th, or it is a specific cost, or it's a specific list of features. But it is not a single point, and it is not an estimate. And a business plan, or a target rather, business target is a vision of a desirable end state that includes some definition of functionality, cost, and schedule. And normally the business is not asking for a target. Normally they are defining a target and asking technical staff for a plan to meet a target, but they may actually be using the word estimate to ask for that. And I think it's important to understand that the business targets are often not achievable in their initial state. That is, in the initial description of cost, schedule, and functionality. That doesn't change the fact that that's a desirable end state. Even if the initial state is incredibly impossible, they could still be highly desirable. And as a technical people, we need to acknowledge that sometimes and engage with it, not just automatically say, oh, that's impossible. Because in the business's eyes, that's something that would be desirable, and so we need to at least engage with it at that level. So the importance of terminology is that when the business comes to you and asks for an estimate, you need to be sure you're answering the question the business is really asking. Sometimes the business will ask for an estimate, but what they're really asking for is a commitment. Sometimes they're asking for a plan to meet a target. And then every once in a while, the business uses the word estimate to actually ask for an estimate. I couldn't tell you whether it's more likely that they use that to actually ask for an estimate, or more likely that they're asking for a commitment or a target. I guess if I had to guess, I think the word estimate is probably used to ask for a commitment as often as anything else. Now, the importance of terminology is that we cannot expect others in the business necessarily to maintain clarity on this terminology. Now that you've been introduced to the difference in these terms, you really have to be the one that takes ownership of clarifying terminology. And it is not realistic to expect others in the business to come up and stop using the word estimate when they're really asking you for a commitment or a plan to meet a target. So in support of helping you understand when the business is asking you for something else by using the word estimate, I'd like to go through some signs that you're really being asked for something different. So sign number one that you're being asked for a commitment might look something like this. Management won't accept estimates expressed as ranges or best case, worst case, or anything like that. Well, if you're being asked for a single point, quote, estimate, you're probably not really being asked for an estimate. You're probably really being asked for a commitment. And it's important in this case that you respond appropriately. If you go back with a range, management's going to think you're not cooperative, because they're going to think, why would anybody ever commit to a range? You can't really commit to a range. And so you need to come back responding with a single point cost, or a single point date, or a specific list of functionality. But if you're really being asked for a commitment, don't come back with an estimate. Come back with a commitment. Example number two that you're being asked for a commitment is that management asked you to reduce your estimate. Well, as I said in the other segment, this really isn't rational, especially if the estimate is already expressed as a range. If you've already expressed it as a range, the idea that you're going to further reduce your range doesn't really make sense. You've already said what the low end of the range is, so reducing that even further, it just degrades accuracy. It's not going to help planning. But it is rational if management is really asking you to make a more aggressive commitment. So here too, we need to dialogue with our business partner or with management so that we can understand, are they really asking us for an estimate that is an analytical prediction, or are they really asking us to commit to something which is a different kind of activity? So those are a couple guidelines on identifying commitments that are called estimates. Sometimes you'll be asked to come up with a plan to meet a target, and that can look a little bit different. The big clue here is, has the business defined all of scope, schedule, and cost or effort? And I often work with companies where staff on the company will say, well, our business typically doesn't estimate. They give us as a done deal all of scope, schedule, and cost or effort. Well, it's not really a done deal. They're just defining a desirable end state with a hope that they can actually achieve that desirable end state, but the expectation really is that you come back and validate whether that hope is a realistic hope or not. And so really it's important to understand that what they're really asking you for when they give you all three corners of the triangle, the so-called iron triangle, when they give you all three corners of scope, schedule, and cost fixed, that what they're really asking you for is a plan to meet those targets. And so again, here too, it's important that you respond appropriately. If you come back with an estimate that's just out of alignment with all three of those targets, it's going to look like you're being unresponsive to what the real request was, which was coming back with a plan. So let's take a look at a scenario which I think is a pretty common scenario, or a representative of a common scenario. In this scenario, which I've titled, "Your Estimate is Unacceptable," in step number 1, the manager says, "How long do you estimate this functionality will take? And by the way, it needs to be ready for a trade show on April 1st. Now in step number 2, the team goes away and estimates. Step number 3, the team comes back with this estimate and explains, we've done a very detailed estimate, and our estimate is that, best case, we can deliver this functionality by July 1st. Now how does management respond to this? Typically they respond as, step 4, manager, didn't you hear me? I said we needed to have this functionality by April 1st. And so the manager then says to himself or herself, these software guys just don't get it. I said it had to be ready by April 1st, and they came back with an estimate of July 1st. Meanwhile, the software team says to itself, our manager is unreasonable and irrational. I wonder if that seems common to you. It's common in the groups that I've worked with over the years. And from my point of view, the software team here is at least partly at fault. Because in creating the detailed estimate, the team ignored the information about needing to be ready for the trade show on April 1st. The team was really only hearing half of the request. Now, why the team only heard the part of the request about estimating the functionality and didn't hear the half about being ready on April 1st, I'll leave it to you to try to think through why that might happen. In my experience, that is the half that the teams happen to hear. I'm not sure why that is, but that is what seems to happen. And so what really the team should have heard is they should have heard two conflicting ideas or requests. They should have heard one request that please estimate this functionality, and a second request of there's a constraint that the work has to be done by April 1st. And I think there was a better way to deal with that. I think it's important to understand that businesses are going to ask for what they want, and that's actually a healthy dynamic. The business doesn't know what is capable in terms of software delivery capability, but they do know what they want, and they know what would be desirable. And so I think we need to interact with them at that level. That is, understanding that what they're defining is typically desirable, but we can't expect them to know what's realistic. That's really our job to know what's realistic. And so businesses will ask for the moon. They will typically ask for things that are wildly unrealistic, and I think you can pretty much expect that dynamic for the rest of your career. I've been working in software for over 30 years now. It's been a common dynamic for 30 years, and I don't think that's going to change because I think it's human nature, and human nature is not going to change. And so I think you can just assume that businesses' initial requests are typically going to be very optimistic compared to what is actually possible. Now, I think on your end, I think it's your job to know what's possible, and that's healthy too. It's your job to know what's realistic, and it's actually okay for you to say something like, given our current development capability, we cannot fully satisfy all of these objectives at the same time. The business wants you to be able to satisfy all the objectives. The business doesn't necessarily expect you to be able to satisfy all the objectives, and it's important to understand those aren't the same thing. What the business wants and what it expects are not the same thing. And so as you express your your evaluation of how realistic the business's request is, I think it's really important that at the same time, especially if the business has come to you with something that's pretty unrealistic, it's really important that you also express cooperation. You need to express cooperation about helping the business come up with an optimal plan so that you can meet the business objectives as well as possible, and not just treat the business like they don't know what they're talking about. They already know that they don't know what they're talking about in terms of software delivery capability, and it's our job to help them take what we know about what's possible on the delivery side or the development capability side and line that up with what they want to achieve on the business opportunity side. So what we find is that anytime we have a communication with conflicting information, that is the conflict between we want this functionality and we want it all by April 1st, that actually creates an opportunity to collaborate with the customer, and ideally to come up with something that's better than if we just try to operate at cross purposes or don't collaborate with the customer. So going back to our scenario, the way that would look is something like this. The manager makes the same statement. How long do you estimate this functionality will take? And by the way, we need it by April 1st. But the response is a little different. Our response should be something more like this. It sounds like we have two priorities. First, the functionality, and second, the April 1st trade show. If, for sake of argument, let's say we go off and the team estimates the functionality and we find that it can't be ready by April 1st, do you want us to come back with an estimate for all the functionality, which will be some date beyond April 1st, or do you want us to come back with a plan to deliver as much functionality as we can by April 1st, or do you want us to do something different? And this is putting us in a cooperative posture where we're trying to understand what the real priorities are or what the ranking of the priorities is, so that we can go off and actually try to satisfy the needs of the business. And I think this scenario leads us into some set of do's and don'ts about what you should do when you're being asked for an estimate. The first don't is don't assume when your customer asks for an estimate that they really literally mean estimate. They could easily mean commitment or plan to meet a target. Don't expect your customers to like it when they hear they can't have everything they wanted in the time frame they wanted it. I don't know about you, but I'm not usually very happy when I hear news that isn't what I expected or wanted to hear. So I think it's unrealistic of us to expect our customers to be happy when they hear that they're not going to be able to get everything that they wanted. And sometimes as technical people, we do expect that. It's not realistic. Do expect your customer to try to find a way to have everything they wanted in the first place. And that implies that you should also expect the customer or the business partner to probe you while trying to find ways to have it all. That may feel quite uncomfortable because they're going to try to press you to see if there's any possible way that they can get what they really wanted. And that's actually a very rational activity. And I would say if they're in a management position, in fact, they're not really doing their job if they don't do that. If you think about it, would you really want to have a manager in your organization who says, I'd really like to have this capability delivered by this date, and somebody else says, well, we can't really do that, and then the manager just says, okay, no problem. No, we really want the manager to try to explore, is there some possible way to achieve that objective? So that might not be the most comfortable when you're on the receiving end of that probing, but I think it's a healthy activity overall, and it's important that we play our role in that dialogue, which is we respond positively and constructively and knowledgeably about what the real delivery capability of our organization is. Do expect the customer ultimately to accept what is and is not possible, but not without some probing first. Do find out whether the customer is really asking for an estimate, describing a target, or asking for a commitment, and do provide the customer what the customer is really asking for.